Hello, everybody. Thanks for watching that 80s Pastor Dude. My name is Lee. Uh, Go ahead and like this video, leave comments down below, subscribe to this channel, click the little ringy bell so you know when new videos come out, and I appreciate you just taking the time to watch this. Now all that is out of the way, for this video I want to look at my 10 favorite albums during my senior year of high school, and I need to explain what I mean by that. My last day of 11th grade was June the 12th, 1987. So any album that came out on June 12th or before is excluded from this list, even though I was probably listening to a lot of that during my senior year. And I graduated June the 10th, 1988. So any album that came out on June the 10th or later is excluded from this list. So our time frame is June 12th, 1987 to June 10th, 1988. Now that that is out of the way, I will go ahead and tell you that some of my favorite albums of all time came out during that time frame, but I'm going to be honest. I wasn't listening to them at that point in my life. They are bands that I really like now that I didn't get into when I was in high school. REM is one of them. Document came out during this time frame, and even though I remember seeing a couple of videos on MTV and heard a couple of songs on the radio and I liked them, I didn't own the album. I wasn't listening to it a lot. So it's not on this list, even though it's one of my favorites now. Likewise, King's X first album came out during this time frame, and that album is one of my favorite albums of all time. Out of the Silent Planet is literally top shelf for me, but I was not listening to King's X when I was in high school. I didn't discover them until 89 or 90. And then they quickly became one of my favorite bands. Another album that is noticeably missing is The Joshua Tree by U2, which came out in March of 1987, and that album was huge. Those videos were all over MTV, the songs were all over the radio, and I liked them. But I did not buy that album when I was in high school. It wasn't until after I got out of high school and started playing in a band that I really started getting into some of these other bands, and some of those albums now are favorites. Joshua Tree is one of my favorite albums. Out of the Silent Planet, one of my favorite albums. But I was not listening to those during my senior year of high school. You will notice a certain type of music is displayed here, but that's what I was into. Although I was starting to dip my toes into other types of music, and you'll see some of that up here. I don't apologize for any of these albums. This is what I was listening to when I was 17 years old. Uh, there's a couple of them up here that, I'll be honest with you, I haven't listened to in a very long time. But if I hear a song from them, I feel nostalgic. So I'm going to be brutally honest. And like I said, let me know what you think about these particular albums in the comments below. And if you're my age and we're in high school back then, what were you listening to during that same time frame? And I'm not going to list any of these in any type of order because I tried to rank them when I sat down and started this list, and I originally had a list of about 17 albums, and I narrowed it down to the 10 that I know for a fact that I can sit here and look at this camera and say I was listening to them, I owned them, and I won't be stretching the truth or exaggerating or worse, lying. So these are not in order. These are basically going in the order that they were released. So this is chronological with the exception of one because I couldn't find the actual release date. Number one is Ace Frehley's Comet. Ace was the guitar player from Kiss, and he went solo, and this was his first album under the band name Frehley's Comet. Anton Fig, who was the drummer for David Letterman, played on this, and they only put out a couple of albums and a live album, and then Ace went solo and started releasing things under his own name. But the first Frehley's Comet album, that's a great album. That is one I will still listen to occasionally. Got a really cool song called Into the Night that I absolutely love. Number two is Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. Came out in July of 1987. So this is stuff that was coming out after I was out of 11th grade. I was working at Pizza Inn, which is where a lot of my life was focused on at that time. I had just met some guys that I was going to eventually be in a band with. And so I was listening to a lot of music. And if you were alive at that point, whether you liked it or not, you heard the songs off of this album. Welcome to the Jungle, Paradise City, Sweet Child of Mine. This is a important debut album. It's an important hard rock album because it started to shift from that overtly glam pop metal to something a little darker and raunchier. Even though Guns N' Roses get thrown into that whole hair metal thing, they were really different. They had a very different vibe to them. This album felt dangerous, and I absolutely loved it. I played this one constantly. Uh, Next up is Def Leppard's Hysteria. Huge album. Came out in August of '87. It had been forever since Pyromania came out. And you can go back and watch the behind the music and read all the stuff that happened. Drummer loses his arm, has to learn how to play drums with one arm. And they released this juggernaut of an album that actually didn't gain a lot of traction initially. But once the video started getting played, this thing was huge. Once Pour Some Sugar on Me became a bona fide hit, which would be later on in 1987. I probably heard that song at least 10 or 15 times a week ever since 1987. Really don't like that song very much anymore. Really don't care much for most of Hysteria anymore. But at the time, this one was huge. Def Leppard was the first rock concert I went to without my mom going. My mom actually took me to go see Heart. That was my first one. But LA Guns and Def Leppard was the first solo show I went to. That album was huge, and I still like some of it, but not quite as much as I did then. It hasn't aged well. This one I revisited not too terribly long ago just because I was thinking about high school, but it's Aerosmith's Permanent Vacation. It wasn't their comeback album. That was done with Mirrors, but this was the first album where they started having hits. Once again, if you had MTV and you were listening to the radio, you heard the hits off this album. Ragdoll, Angel, Dude Looks Like a Lady. This album was huge. My favorite track on it is probably St. John or Hangman Jury. They're a little bluesier, but I still like most of this album. Some of it hasn't aged well. The lyrics are just kind of cringy, but Aerosmith's Permanent Vacation was a big album during my senior year of high school. And these next three, there's a common theme here. These next three were all albums released by bands that for the most part were considered prog, or at least prog rock. And these three albums were poppier. These three albums were more commercially available. But it was my introduction into what I call prog rock, and I ended up becoming a fan of all three of these albums. The first one is Hold Your Fire by Rush. Came out September '87. Came out right as I started my senior year of high school. And the song that did it for me was Time Stand Still. I heard that on the radio, and the lyrics just captivated me. I was familiar with the name Rush, and I had probably heard Tom Sawyer and Limelight on the radio. But they were not a band I got into, but when I heard Time Stand Still, it fascinated me. I went out and got this album, although I think I was actually given this album as a Christmas present from my best friend at the time. But once I digested that album, I dove into Rush head first. And then the next one, and you'll see I'm wearing a sweatshirt that is a reproduction of a shirt from this tour, was Pink Floyd's A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Roger Waters had left and David Gilmour had taken over. And even though there's some proggy stuff on this one, it is very much radio friendly. In fact, there were a couple of radio hits. Learning to Fly, Dogs of War, and then quite possibly my favorite Pink Floyd song, On the Turning Away. I love this album. It's my favorite Pink Floyd album, right above The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon. And like I said, I'm wearing the shirt. And then, yes, Big Generator also came out in September of 1987. So those three albums all came out right as I went back to school for my senior year of high school. This was the second of the Trevor Rabin Yes albums. The first one being 90125, which was a few years earlier. That was the big one that had... oh my goodness, I can't think of the name of the song now. You know the song, Owner of a Lonely Heart. This one had the title track Big Generator, Love Will Find a Way. Once again, very much radio friendly, and some of those songs got played on MTV, some of them got played on the radio, but this was my true introduction into Yes. I remember Owner of a Lonely Heart and Leave It off the first album, but this is one I started digesting, and right along with Rush and Pink Floyd, it kind of turned me away from some of the hair metal stuff and started pursuing what I would call prog rock, and I started to explore the catalogs of all three of those bands. Next up is Kiss, Crazy Nights. This is just a goofball album. It's bubblegum pop metal. Some people think it's the worst Kiss album, but it had hits. The title track was one of them. But the track I loved the most on this was called Thief in the Night. It was one Gene Simmons was singing. But this album is highly produced. It doesn't sound anything at all like the makeup era Kiss. And it really doesn't even sound like the non-makeup albums that preceded it. Very much bubblegum pop metal. And lyrically, it hasn't aged well. But there are a couple of tracks on this that I still like. Next up is Van Halen OU812. I discovered Van Halen when I started to drive the year before. I had a Toyota Celica with an 8-track tape player. The only 2 8-track tapes I had were REO Speedwagon, High Infidelity, and the first Van Halen album. And incidentally, 1986 is when Sammy Hagar joined Van Halen and 5150 came out. So the 2 albums I was digesting to discover Van Halen was the debut with David Lee Roth and the debut with Sammy Hagar. And this was the follow-up to the Sammy Hagar 5150. The songs to me are not as strong as some of the ones on 5150 and not as strong as some of the stuff they would do later on. But it's got some really, really good songs. And this was me really deciding that Van Halen was one of my favorite bands. And once again, because I became a fan at this time, I was able to go back and explore. I kind of knew what Van Halen was. I remember 1984 when it came out, Jump and Panama. But the Sammy Hagar album is the era that really snagged me because of the age I was. And OU812 has got some songs that really stand the test of time. And then number 10, I leave it at last because I'm not exactly sure when it came out, but Petra's This Means War. It is still one of my favorite Petra albums. This was the second album they did with John Schlitt as vocalist. Still has John and Dino Elefante playing on it, or producing, excuse me. But the production is much crisper. The production is a little heavy. I actually like Back to the Street more than this album, but the production hinders it. This is a solid Petra album. Honestly, the only song I really don't like on it is I Am Available. I do like the song, but it really doesn't fit the vibe because this is a really cool, pseudo-proggy rock album. It sounds like it could have been a Kansas album, and obviously that's because John and Dino Elefante, but the guitars are a lot crunchier, and I know there's some drum machines and sequencers and stuff like that, but it's a little more organic than Back to the Street, even though I prefer that one a little more. But this album rocks, and rightfully so because Petra means rock. Like I said, there are a lot of other albums that I was listening to, but sitting down, being honest, these were the 10 during my senior year of high school that I actually owned copies of and I listened to on a consistent basis. So what did you think? Any of these are your favorite albums? Let me know down below. If some of these you absolutely hate, let me know. What were you listening to if you were around in 1987, 1988? Or what were you listening to your senior year of high school, whenever that may have been? Once again, leave those comments, like the video, subscribe to this channel. Go check me out on Facebook and X, or Twitter as I still call it. And thanks for watching. I'm Lee, and I'm done.